If you're new in town or just new to this whole podcast thing, you're tuning in to Lore by Night, the podcast that discusses all things vampiric with no fear of breaching the Masquerade. In this episode, we shall review Vampire the Dark Ages 20th Anniversary Edition, as I present my thoughts and opinions on its presentation and mechanics to help you better decide whether this is the game for you. 20 weeks ago, at the time of recording, I gave you my thoughts and opinions on Vampire the Masquerade 20th Anniversary Edition, which I believe was a highly positive review with some minor niggles regarding the presentation of the clans and bloodlines in their writing, their artwork, and that some newer players may find a lot of the mechanics confusing. I would prepare to argue that this is the finest VTM has been presented, so how would one improve such a biasedly fantastic format? Whilst many would state that it is V5 that would take things up a notch, which I cannot deny did many wonderful things to the lore and presentation of the World of Darkness, I believe that it is by going backwards that the many writers and developers of today's book, Vampire the Dark Ages 20th Anniversary Edition, or V20 Dark Ages, has presented some of the most engaging and fantastic writing in any VTM book in recent years. Now, having spoilt the ending of this review, let us work backwards from there and discuss the book, its contents, and what makes it a fantastic core book in my opinion. But first, here are the rules to the Lore by Night book reviews. I will explore snippets of the lore, mechanics, and rules found within the tome. I will look as to how they are presented and easily they are conveyed to new and old players alike. As this is a review written and presented by me, all thoughts and opinions are my own, so if you disagree with something I have said, that is totally fine. It does not mean you are right and I am wrong, and vice versa. As with my previous book reviews, I will start at the very beginning, which is the physical book itself, which currently sits nicely upon my lap. Like regular V20, it is made of a slightly squishy material, possibly some form of cardboard. I'm never too sure what these hardbacks are made out of. Anyway, it is somewhat harder than its vanilla counterpart, but it is a tome that will mark easily all the same. Once more, leaving my copy of the book for a few mere moments resulted in the family cat's clawing the book, but the damage here is not so noticeable unless you shine it in the light. Similarly, because I have used my book a lot, one can see the bends in the plastic film that envelopes the cover, most notably across the spine of the book. This does not bother me so much, but I know that sort of thing will annoy some weird people. My solution to this is to purchase the PDF copy like a sensitive weirdo. One thing about the actual book itself I despise is the marble background itself. From a distance, both the front and back covers of the book look marvellous, reminiscing on the original Vampire the Dark Ages design, including a fancy new title font and a brand new Unk or Ank slapped in the centre of the front cover of the book. Look a little closer, and you'll notice just how pixelated and distorted the marble is, and once you notice it, you will never be able to unsee it. It is that offensive. You're welcome. I am unsure why this was deemed acceptable for release, regardless of what version of the physical edition of the book you have purchased, so I had initially hoped that either I was very unlucky or it was a detail that was overlooked somehow, but I would soon find that with future V20 Dark Ages related purchases that this problem is consistently inconsistent, as some of my V20 Dark Ages books have this problem whilst others do not. Fortunately, that is the only artistic choice I loathe, for every other piece of artwork in this book is done just fantastically. Whether it is the realistic approach of the clan and bloodlines, the new Dark Ages shield crests for said kindred, or the various older Dark Ages art that is being repurposed, I loved the detail of the art in this book that captures medieval Canaanite life, fashion, and warfare perfectly, none of which looking too cartoonish to me. I cannot fault it. V20 Dark Ages is a much bigger and thus heavier book than V5 and V20, not as dummy thick as Mage and Wraith 20th Anniversary editions, but it is not far off. I will explore as to why the book is much heavier, despite being a medieval iteration of V20 later in this review. Just know, for thou, it is a big boy. Upon opening the book, you are greeted with the typical VTM introductory topics, a clear and concise contents page, a brilliant opening short story, and the introductory chapter that tells the reader what is Vampire the Dark Ages and the mythos vampires have in this world. V20 Dark Ages presents this in a slightly different fashion than V5 and V20, mainly by just getting straight to the point and not faff around too much with fancy writing, while still delivering the gut punch I love receiving from Vampire the Masquerade. That being said, something else that is altered slightly is how K-Knights have sex, or more precisely, the mindset of K-Knights in V20 Dark Ages that partake in intercourse when compared to those of V20 and V5. All three tomes state that vampires partake in coitus, mainly as a way of feeding, the ecstasy of the kiss being a much more satisfactory climax, a better climax if you would, than any naturally occurring orgasm. V20 Dark Ages states that it is unabashedly true that vampire existence is one taboo and dark celebration, to directly quote the passage in question. What I love about this small passage of text is no part a reflection of my thirst, but a subtle but pronounced reinforcement of vampires are cursed sin in flesh form, how they are morally different from their once former mortal selves, how they strive to detach themselves from their human thinking counterparts and embrace in the devilishly pleasant aspects that their new unlife would bring them. It is a very different mindset to the Vampires the Masquerade games that came before and after it has. And before you say anything, no, I do not believe or encourage the idea that all vampires are horny husks of undead flesh. That is just childish and remarkably immature. The V20 Dark Ages introductory chapter concludes with 3 short paragraphs that walks through the new player what is the hunger, how a K-Knight would hunt, and how one would feed, which is a very interesting thing to include in a Vampire the Masquerade book, mostly because I cannot recall seeing this in any other Vampire the Masquerade core book I own, especially not in this detail. The one strange thing about this I find, however, is that I doubt that very few people would have this as their first vampire book. I have a few friends and acquaintances where this was the case, but they are very much in the minority. My point being is that most Vampire the Masquerade players are well aware of these elements, despite never exploring it in as much detail as presented in these few pages. That said, you should read it anyway, for reasons I am about to explore. Chapter 1 begins to dive a little deeper into K-Knight terminology, the themes and subjects such as the embrace and what are the generation titles, the tradition, amongst other familiar Vampire the Masquerade terms. Being a Dark Ages book, this chapter also covers themes mostly unique to the setting, such as the War of Princes, the differences between the High and Low clans, and the roads, which are similar to the Paths of Enlightenment, but the paths originate from the roads. While seasoned Vampire the Masquerade fans may skip over this chapter, believing they already know it all, which is very easy to do, what you will find is that there are subtle nuances that add familiar topics new flavour, which is partly down to the fact the entire chapter is written through the first person, i.e. it is a K-Knight talking to another, allowing the reader to learn about these important vampire elements in what I believe is an incredibly organic but occasionally confusing manner. In fewer words, it is a K-Knight conversation. A shining example of these nuances can be found in the very short paragraph on the beast and the differences found in Dark Ages traditions, which you can read at your own leisure. The following chapter is all about the clans of Cain, or the clans and bloodlines that players and storytellers can include in their stories. Their layout of such is very similar to the V20 format, but nicer, as the artwork is more realistic, or should I say, less cartoony. Some clans have minor differences in their weaknesses and relationships with other clans, for lore reasons, which is something players should be aware of when reading this book. Now, whilst I do not wish to explore the lore too much here, as I have done podcast episodes about each of the clans in extensive and hopefully entertaining detail, I wish to talk about the bloodline section of the chapter, which not only corrects a presentation issue I had, but the write-up on each individual bloodline just blew me away, expanding the imagination tenfold, exploring and discussing elements that should have always been included in V20, which was marketed as a celebration of VTM up until that point. For example, seasoned Vampire the Masquerade enthusiasts know that the Ander, Lianon and Aramain bloodlines are a result of the Gangrel getting around. Many players, myself included, will look in V20 and be somewhat puzzled by their existence and what importance they have. V20 Dark Ages explores their origins and cultures almost as if V20 didn't even exist, making you, the reader, care for these diverse bloodlines. You can't call the Ander a Gangrel because the sire didn't stick around after they embraced a Mongol and saw how the culture evolved with them. The other mains have an origin story that doesn't hint towards anything close to the Gangrel, making them, and many other bloodlines, very mysterious, far more here than in other Vampire the Masquerade books. In doing so, the Aramain's unique discipline, Spiritus, is also given a legitimate backstory, one that doesn't feel horseshoed in like it did when I read V20. Curiously, the Noead are not present in this book at all, despite being a Dark Ages bloodline. I can only presume this is because they are the only bloodline that is not a playable concept for players. The Lianan have had some revisions to their origins and writing when compared to V20 that does so much to improve the inherent terror that exhibits from them and the twisted nature of their culture that they have become my favourite bloodline. Their association with the Crone, subtle hints in the writing that they are also wielders of cultonic sorcery outside of the sacrificial Argum, and their macabre but tasteful take on paganism is just awesome. Whoever wrote about them in this book, I say thank you for making them so badass and terrifying. Then there are also the 3 bloodlines that do not exist anywhere else, which can only be found in this book at the time of recording, and they are of course the Bansam, Impedulu, and Ramanga, Liabon of Ye Old Africa, who are some of my favourite additions in this book. The Ultimate Hunter, Africa's Blood Brothers, and the Frightening Necromancer have such interesting backstories and ways of thinking and behaviours and are all terrifying to behold, especially the Bansam, who are arguably the most terrifying and deadly of all the bloodlines. Whilst I am a little confused as to why these Liabon were introduced at all, I am very glad that they were added all the same. The Impedulu are an interesting yet harrowing bloodline, and the Ramanga somehow managed to do La Sombra better than La Sombra. I could go on about how I love the revisions made to the Kiasi as Fae-touched mortals turned vampires, how the Lamia were a cult found by Lazarus, or how the true Bruja are borderline tolerable and not as antsy in V20, but you get the idea by now that I love this chapter and reckon you should purchase this book for these alone. The only complaint I could find with this chapter is I found on the section regarding with the gargoyles, which mentions that some followed the road of service, which is not found in V20 Dark Ages, but in the book House of Tremere. A small gripe, but a gripe all the same. Chapters 3 through 5 are to do with character creation, with Chapter 3 discussing the roads and Chapter 4 being character creation proper. I shan't discuss too much about these, as I plan on doing podcast episodes on the roads and paths of enlightenment very soon, and I've already waffled on about V20 Dark Ages character creation. Just know that everything makes sense, and it is all easy to understand. A little easier than it is in V20, which is something given how some of the abilities are exclusive to V20 Dark Ages. Don't just take my word for it though, or presume that because you have done V20 character creation or even older vampire games, you know about the roads, paths, and know how to make a vampire. This is a new book that has revised material with new nuances, such as the entire Road of Lilith. My one negative critique is that not all the roads are in this chapter, for some are located towards the back of the book, the appendix, or in the Apocrypha of the Clan section. I usually forget that chapter exists when making characters. I shouldn't, for there are some beautiful lore snippets in there, such as lost letters from Carthage. Chapter 5 details literally all the disciplines that have ever disciplined. This chapter, and Chapter 2, is the reason why this book is as thick as this. What can be slightly confusing is all the magic-based disciplines and rituals are grouped together, separate from the main disciplines, which on the surface makes sense, but it can make looking for abyss mysticism with the disciplines that begin with A, or cultonic sorcery, when you expect it to be roughly in the middle of the chapter, for example. This can also be complicated by the fact that some of the discipline powers have slightly different names. Combination disciplines make a return here, wonderful new descriptions of each different form of blood sorcery, and a more personal and horrifying revision of a Bombwe, the unique discipline of the Bonsam and the Akananse that can be found in Kindred of the Ebony Kingdom. Moving on to the following 2 chapters has us look at the crunch of the game, i.e. the rules and mechanics themselves. Everything in these chapters is much easier to read when compared to V20 and V5 in my totally biased opinion, and that is including the unnecessary list of every possible sort of dice roll that players and STs are unlikely to follow to the letter, in addition to various tables of weapon types one can wield in game, which can be a little overwhelming to interpret the writer's shorthand and the sheer intensity of it all. Following this is the storytelling chapter, which is filled with everything you would expect it to be filled with. How to plan a chronicle, how to create story characters, etc, etc, with the addition of many sample NPCs and animals with stats for anyone to use, which is just super helpful. Most importantly is the expansion of faith and true faith, which I believe is impossible not to include in a Dark Ages game, given how the cult movement that is Catholicism is slowly taking over the world at this point. I find the different ideas presented for how to receive and handle true faith to be very inspiring, as well as the idea of introducing holy relics and artifacts. I just wish there were more examples as to how to create them for storytellers to use for their games. Once you have those down, the preceding chapter gives you places all over Europe for you to dump your ideas, as you are told what is happening up until 1242, the default starting year for the game. I have two complaints regarding this chapter. The first is that this is by far the most dry and unengaging section of the book, which is understandable. The other is that neither Africa or the UK are mentioned, which is baffling, given that the Liabon, the kindred of the Ebony Kingdom, Africa, are included in this book, including 3 new and unique ones, and the UK were doing some important things during this time as well. I can only speculate that these were omitted so players would purchase Dark Ages British Isles and Kindred of the Ebony Kingdom. That said, the UK would appear in the future companion guide for this book, which kinda but not really makes it easier for STs to run games in the mid-13th century UK and Europe, but not Africa. This nicely leads me to mentioning my V20 Dark Ages game, The Crimson Facade, which may or may not have hit the airwaves by the time this episode goes live. It was originally intended to be my debut as a storyteller, which is just as exciting as it is frightening. You may think me fishmouth mad for wanting to pop my ST cherry with a Dark Ages game, but I really don't care. The material found in this book, this setting, the bloodlines, the revision of the classic disciplines inspired me greatly to take up the mantle of storyteller, furthering my excitement with this game, its lore, and this ye old world of darkness. As you may have gathered, I adore practically everything in this book, and can find very little to fault it, which as a moody as fuck critic such as myself, it is really annoying and impeccably frustrating to admit that. Whether you love VTM for its lore, or just want to play a Dark Ages game, but you can't get to the older versions or fed up trying to homebrew V5 and pretend to make it work, do yourself a favour and get V20 Dark Ages. And for those of you who are new to the Lore by Night brand and the reviews I occasionally do, I do not do out of 10 scores because they are subjectively pointless. One person's 10 out of 10 is another's 3 out of 5 stars, which is another's minus 42 out of 100. So I shall rate this game Warrior Cast out of 10, as that is just as helpful as a proper out of 10 score. To be kept updated, follow the Lore by Night VTM Twitter and Instagram pages to find out when we will upload each episode. You can also find out by subscribing to the YouTube channel and clicking on the little bell, as you'll be immediately notified when the latest episode is live. Until next time, farewell.